Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we've got a story for you. A legal battle that really puts the strict letter of the law up against the clear, final wish of a woman who couldn't even read the words meant to protect her.
So let's talk about Cecilia Cosico. She was a woman whose physical disability meant she lived her entire life inside her room. And when she passed away, the one thing she wanted, to leave her property to the woman who cared for her, well, that got put on trial. It sparked a fight that lasted a decade over what really matters, following rigid rules to the letter or honoring a person's final, heartfelt intent.
All right, so to really get into this, we first need to understand who Cecilia was and what she so clearly wanted to happen after she was gone.
You know, this story unfolds over nearly a century. It starts all the way back in 1932 with Cecilia's birth. Then, she makes her will in 1996. But the real legal drama, get this, it didn't even start until years after her death, finally wrapping up with a Supreme Court decision in 2021 that would define her entire legacy.
So, to really get this, you have to picture Cecilia's life. It was one of complete and total dependence. Her mom died when she was just a baby, so her aunt, Mercedes, she became her entire world, her caregiver, her family, everything. And even though Cecilia never went to school, couldn't read or write, everyone agreed she was sharp, totally of sound mind.
So fast forward to 1996, Cecilia is 64 years old, and she decides it's time. She asks for a lawyer, a notary public, to come to her home. She wanted to make a will. In her own language, it was called huling habilin apagbapasia, which just means last will and testament.
And I mean, you can't get much clearer than that, right? The will spelled it out. Everything she owned was to go to Mercedes, the one person who had spent her entire life taking care of her. It was a final act of gratitude, a final act of love.
But of course, if it were that simple, we wouldn't be talking about it. After Cecilia passed away, and then her aunt Mercedes a few years after that, this simple, clear wish was suddenly thrown into chaos.
So Thelma, Mercedes' daughter, who Cecilia also saw as family, tried to do the right thing. She filed the paperwork to make the will legally binding. And that's when the trouble started. Cecilia's half-siblings, relatives from her father's side, suddenly appeared and challenged the will. Their argument? The will was no good, so the property should go to them as the next of kin.
And look, they didn't just have one little complaint. This was a full-on assault. They claimed it wasn't signed right, that Cecilia wasn't mentally capable, that she was pressured into it, and even that her thumbprint was a fake. They basically threw everything they could think of at the wall just to see what would stick.
And, one of those things they threw at the wall, it actually stuck, at least for a while. This whole massive case came down to how you interpret one single rule in the Philippine Civil Code.
Okay, so let's get into the legal weeds just for a second. We have to talk about Article 808. It's a rule designed to protect people who can't read their own will, like someone who's blind. To stop any funny business, it says the will has to be read out loud twice by two different people. Now, Cecilia wasn't blind, but the courts have always said this rule also applies to people who are illiterate for the exact same reason. Make sense, right?
And this is the single fact that almost unraveled everything. The day the will was signed, the lawyer, Addy Buser, he read the entire will to Cecilia, explained everything, all in front of 3 witnesses. But he only read it once. A witness didn't read it a second time. That's it. And right there, that's the heart of the entire conflict. Does one little procedural slip-up, even on a rule that's meant for protection, does that automatically cancel out what we know was the clear, verified intention of the person making the will?
Well, that one question sent this case on an absolute legal roller coaster, because 2 different courts looked at the exact same situation and came to completely opposite conclusions.
And this is where it gets really fascinating. It's the classic legal fight, right? The spirit of the law versus the letter of the law. The first court, the RTC, said, hey, the will is valid. They focused on the spirit of the law. The whole point was to make sure Cecilia knew what she was signing, and she clearly did. But then the Court of Appeals said, nope, it's void. They focused on the letter of the law. Article 808 says twice, it was done once, end of story.
So, with the lower courts totally deadlocked, there was only one place left to go for a final answer on Cecilia's legacy: the Supreme Court.
And to figure this all out, the Supreme Court brought in this really important legal idea called substantial compliance. It's a simple but powerful concept, really. It basically asks, did we achieve the goal of the law, even if we didn't follow the instructions perfectly? If the answer is yes, then a minor mistake doesn't have to ruin everything. And a quote from a past Supreme Court decision just sums up their thinking perfectly. They said the rules for making a will are there to close the door against bad faith and fraud, not to stop someone from actually making a will. In other words, the rules are supposed to be a shield, not a sword.
So using that logic, the court just laid out the simple facts. The will was read to her, the witnesses were all there, Cecilia herself confirmed it was what she wanted, there was absolutely zero evidence of fraud or trickery. So when you lay it all out like that, they said the whole purpose of Article 808 was achieved. Voiding this will just because of a missing second reading, that would let a technicality completely crush justice.
All right, so the Supreme Court did the right thing and Cecilia's final wish was honored. But this case, it's so much bigger than just this one family story.
What this does is it sends this powerful message that the whole point of the legal system is to find justice, not just to check boxes. When you know what a person truly wanted and you know there was no fraud, the spirit of the law has to win out over a rigid mechanical rule.
And maybe most importantly, a ruling like this really stands up for people like Cecilia. It says, hey, just because you can't read or write or you have a physical disability, that doesn't mean your right to decide what happens to your property gets watered down. The law is supposed to be a protector in these situations, not just another hurdle.
Cecilia Cosico's story gives us one powerful answer. Her final wish was preserved, yeah, but only after a decade-long battle. And it just leaves you wondering, doesn't it? In a world that's full of rules, how do we make absolutely sure that we never lose sight of the justice those rules were created to serve in the first place?